Okay, so today we're going to talk about EQ, which is, for me, the bulk of mixing. If you can't EQ, you can't mix, full stop. And if you can't make a good mix using volume and EQ and panning alone, then you definitely cannot mix. Everything else that comes after that, compression, saturation, effects, blah 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 blah, doesn't really matter so much. EQing is, from my perspective, the absolute core of what you're going to be doing 90% of the time. So, to start with EQing, I think you need to fundamentally learn to hear the different parts of the EQ spectrum. So it's quite easy to do this if you take a basic parametric EQ and a certain instrument that's got a fairly wide range of frequencies and just sort of sweep it along. Poke it up a bit and sweep it along and hear how that sounds. Poke it down, sweep it along, hear how that sounds. Notice how the sound changes. Do that for a lot of different instruments and you'll start to develop an internal feeling for which kind of area sounds like which particular frequency range, right? That is absolutely essential. If you can't do that or you can't develop that, you're going to be really hindering your ability as a mixer. It can take some time to develop that. It's certainly not something that I think people have built into them. Most people can't hear an instrument and go, oh, that has way too much information around the 15K area or whatever. They might be able to hear that there's too much of something, but being able to identify what that is and put it into words, then you can work with it. That's a skill that takes some time, for most people. Perhaps for some people that comes naturally, I don't know. A good tip that I've heard reasonably often and that I agree with is to start the mix by putting everything in mono, adjusting your levels, and then adjust your EQ. Main reason for that is not so much the old reason of, oh, it might play on a mono system later on and it's got to sound balanced on that. That's quite rare nowadays that you have any kind of speaker setup that is in mono. Maybe for some live sound gigs and that sort of thing. So, you know, maybe if you're a DJ and you're playing recorded sets. But generally speaking, most stuff is coming through in stereo and you don't have to worry about that side of things so much. If you did, a lot of electronic music would kind of be screwed because they tend to play with the stereo spectrum a lot more, including a lot of phase cancelling stuff. So, the main reason for EQing and volume, doing your volume and your levels in mono is basically when things are panned to stereo, it's kind of easy to fool yourself a little bit more, just not hear things correctly. You can have something that's kind of on the outside of your mix, you know, quite hard in the left and the right channel, but not a lot in the center. And then you can have another instrument that's in the center. And if you're panned to stereo, then you can have a certain frequency range, let's say 240 Hertz or something. That's quite loud in the outside there, and it's also quite loud in the middle. And these two instruments end up sort of masking each other and kind of blocking each other out of the mix a little bit because you didn't identify that there was a bit of an overlap there. Whereas if you bring everything into mono, it becomes very clear where those overlaps are and what you need to cut out. And when you eventually take that mono mix and pan it back out into stereo, you'll find that it will be a lot clearer in general. One of the things that I recommend that I do myself, and took me a while to actually get around to doing really, was to start your EQ with a really broad strokes EQ. So something like Vibe EQ or Sonomus's Son EQ. Those are both sort of what I would call broad strokes EQs. So they only have a few dials, they only have a few different frequency bands. You can't just move everything all over the place and adjust everything and really fine tune. It's really just for getting that real first impression. Okay, what is there too much of? Okay, let's dial that right the hell down. The other thing that does it takes away some of the visual information, which can be quite misleading. If you've got a general parametric EQ, then it shows you all the curves on screen, and when you boost or cut something by 12 decibels, it looks really big, and visually you're kind of discouraged by that. You think, oh, that's a big change, maybe I shouldn't do that. No, it really doesn't matter how big the change is. What matters is how it sounds. Does it sound good? If it sounds good, cut that crap away or boost it, whatever. So just from a purely psychological perspective, a broad strokes EQ can really help, particularly in those initial stages. And then when you get to the later stages, you add a real fine-tuning parametric EQ or whatever. Broad strokes EQs often allow you to do some kind of easier tricks that you might not do if you thought too hard about them. Most of them have some kind of low pass filter, so taking out the low end of the mix, and usually they'll have a low end boost as well with some adjustment there. And often you can get a really good sound by high passing up to a certain point and then boosting the low end at just below or just above that point to quite a significant extent. I find particularly with anything that's bass heavy like drums or bass, you can often beef up the sound quite significantly while taking away a lot of the sort of the mud, that lower end mud in the mix that is kind of just doing nothing for the overall sound, because most of it is vaguely inaudible anyway. If you remember back to the levels episode that I did earlier, obviously our brain is very sensitive to information that is in the mid-range, and it's not so sensitive to information that's in the low or in the high frequencies. So if you have a lot of information that is, for example, sub 30 Hertz, which, for the most part you can't hear, when that goes into a compressor or something later on, or the mastering limiter or whatever, that compressor or that mastering limiter, unless it's got a high pass filter internal to it, is going to overreact to that and, blah blah. But the main thing is just the sound of it, and you can get a much more punchy sound for your low end if you're doing some high passing and some low end boosting at the same time. This is sort of a bit of a variation on what is also known as the Pultec trick, which is named for a particular brand of particular manufacturer, and they have some EQs. There's a lot of digital Pultec clones. I like one which is called, PTQX. It's a free one, and it has a similar trick, but it's not using a low pass filter. It's just using low end cut and also a low end boost, but the curves on the cut and the boost are different. So if you cut and boost at the same level, you end up with quite a different sound, and that just because of the differing curves. So for anybody who's kind of completely novice and completely new to this whole mixing and EQing side of things, I'll go extremely briefly into the different kinds of EQ curves. If you're using a broad strokes EQ, generally you won't have access to curve information or won't be able to change it. It's just supplied there for you, and you deal with it. But if you're using a parametric EQ or something like that, something like isotope ozone or whatever, then there's different curves that you can select between. You'll have a bell, you might have different variations of bell, which is just something that's like that or like that if you're cutting from the mix. You'll have a low shelf or a high shelf. The high shelf boosts up like that or down like that. Same with the low shelf. And then you have high pass and low pass, which are explicitly cutting stuff out of the mix. And so high pass will come in like that, a curve like that. Low pass comes in a curve like that, and you can adjust the curve. And there's also different types of low pass curves and high pass curves and whatnot. So it can get very specific. But those are the general things there. There's also tilt EQs, which just kind of take the frequency spectrum and tilt it from there, where one end is high and one end is low. Those are not terribly common, and they're not terribly useful most of the time either. So that's enough of that. I mean, if you start EQing, you'll come across that stuff pretty quickly and you'll figure it out. Another tip is to prefer cutting over boosting when you can, and particularly, you know, your main job when you're EQing is taking these different instruments and cutting out a space for them EQ-wise in the mix. Sometimes you don't need to do that so much if you're doing acoustic recordings. If you've got a violin, a piano, a cello, they're all kind of in their own space, and yeah, you'll do some EQing, but you won't need to EQ them violently, particularly since it's acoustic music and we're not going to be cranking up the loudness maximizer or anything like that. So it becomes much less important. It becomes more important to have a natural sound. But you'll still do some EQing. But if you're doing at the complete opposite of end of the spectrum a metal mix, which is in my experience the hardest stuff to mix, because metal, there's a lot of noise, everything tends to be quite loud and quite full, and the complete range of the frequency spectrum is filled up by the different instruments, and there's a lot of overlap as well. So generally how I would look at a metal or a rock mix is generally the drums would be kind of here and here. You've got a lot of high end, you've got a low end, and then some for the kick and a little bit for the toms. The bass is sort of down here. It's not right at the low end. It's sort of above the kick. Although you can switch those two around. You can have a mix where the kick is high and the bass is low. Generally speaking, you see that more in electronic music than in metal or rock. The guitars are up here, more around the sort of 1K, 2K kind of region. The vocals are also somewhere around there, but it's a little bit different. The emphases are different for the EQ. And after that it gets really specific as to the particular track and the particular kind of sound that you're going for, as to what you're boosting, what you're cutting, etc. But that's, to me, that's the hardest thing to do, is really carve out those particular niches for those particular instruments. And if you've got a good recording, then that makes a big difference, because a lot of that work is already done for you by the types of mics that you used, by the placement of the mics, and by the instruments themselves. But inevitably, when you're doing any kind of modern mix, you're going to have to do some carving out of frequency space.